Evan, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. When I agreed to, though, I did not realize my flight was going to be severely delayed, and I was going to land at 2 a.m. last night. So if I'm a little slow, purely from lack of sleep.
I found him chugging coffee upstairs. So I know Evan is probably going on very little sleep, but we're so glad that you made it, and just a privilege to have you here today. Fascinating, the things that Evan, that you've done since your whole lifetime, but really I was reading things about 19 years old, you were founding companies and doing all sorts of stuff. So thank you for all of that. I know we are starting a little bit late, but we still want to try to wrap up around 9:45, 9:50, so I'm just going to jump right into it. And we are going to try to leave some time at the end for Q&A. So should you have questions for Evan, please save them. We'll try to leave at least 10 minutes at the end to take your questions. So just by a little way of background, so you co-founded 1776 in, I believe, 2013-ish.
Yeah.
What was the catalyst for creating that organization? We'll start with that question.
Yeah. So I sold my last company probably about 2011, or the previous startup I was building in about 2011, and I had one of those sort of awkward 1 year, I have to stay even though I don't really have much to do because it was part of the agreement. And I don't do well with boredom and lack of activity. It tends to produce bad results, right? And so I pretty quickly got, almost within a month after the deal closing, somebody from what was Startup America reached out. And Startup America at the time was an initiative that was put in place by the White House and Steve Case. And it was very much an early version of, hey, it's really unhealthy for the country if the only place you feel like you can go to build a high-growth, technology-driven company is Silicon Valley. So how do we get startup ecosystems starting to form around the rest of the country? And so a woman named Donna Harris, who was building out the whole regional program for Startup America, reached out to me and said, hey, we're going to launch this thing called Startup DC. A number of people have recommended you. Do you want to talk? And almost immediately hit it off with Donna. It was just complete clicking. And we very much agreed on the fact that there were these unbelievable assets in the DC region. Right? One of the wealthiest regions in the country, incredible expertise in certain industries, Fortune 500 headquarters, the Pentagon, federal government, huge international connections, all this stuff. And yet there was really no meaningful startup ecosystem. And it was sort of well, how is it possible that we have all these incredibly unique assets and it's not in some way being used to create startups? And so I spent a year sort of volunteering as the sort of community leader for this program called Startup DC. And that sort of basic thesis that Don and I hashed out in our first coffee together just kept unpacking and unpacking and unpacking. And very quickly you realize it's cultural. It's not a lack of capital. It's not a lack of talent. It's not a lack of access to companies you can partner with or anything else. In the DC region in particular, you have this sort of phenomenon where the business community is very fragmented. So you have an entire massive government contracting community. You have a giant K Street capital lobbying media community. You have this sort of old line left over from the dot-com boom sort of startup ecosystem that's based way out in the suburbs and they never come in the city, or they didn't back then. And you have the real estate world, right? And they just didn't talk to each other. And so that was a huge part of what we were trying to do, it was actually in part, how do we start to bring energy around sort of just innovation and startup activity, period. But in a certain sense, we realized to do that, we were going to have to defrag the business community, period, because we needed all those resources to come together, and we needed to change the conception of what DC could be. And then, while doing that with Donna, I had the opportunity to kind of go visit what 500 Startups was doing, and they were a year and a half old in California, or what Techstars was doing in Boulder. And I think at that point it was Techstars Boulder, and they had just launched Techstars Boston, the first Techstars outside of Boulder, or what Capital Factory was doing down in Austin, and they had just launched, or what 1871, who is just launching, was doing in Chicago. So got to sort of see all these different models form, and all that came together into 1776. So it was sort of oh, I like a little bit of that, I like a little bit of that, But I want to put it all through the lens of how do we build a startup ecosystem for the DC region that is genuinely unique and authentic to the assets that we have, which is, hey, let's not go build more government contractors because we have those in spades and they're not really doing a lot of good in the world or a lot of interesting things. But let's still build off of like the single thing that makes DC unique in the world, which is it's the heart of the federal government, right? So that was the origin.
So through 1776, what were the types of companies that you were looking to fund, and what were the companies that you maybe wanted to stay away from?
Yeah, I mean, so the first lens into that was, again, we weren't really interested in just helping build more government contractors, but we wanted to play off of the kinds of talent that uniquely was attracted in coming to Washington, D.C. And so the lens was actually much more about policy and regulation than it was sell shit to the government. Sometimes you need to sell things to the government, but like that wasn't really the lens. And so that very quickly was like, all right, well, what are the industries and what are the sectors where insight into policy and insight into how to affect and shape policy are going to be uniquely important? And pretty quickly you arrive at what ironically is the 80% of the economy that needs innovation the most, which is education, healthcare, transportation, smart cities, food, financial services, which when you think about it is almost all of the economy actually. And at the time, right, fintech wasn't even really a thing yet, right? There was sort of a small ed tech community. That was a really, really contrarian thesis, because that was back when pretty much everyone was convinced the future of all technology innovation was photo sharing apps. And so there was the whole photo, and like, we had a really tough time early on, like driving this thesis that like, hey, entrepreneurs that are in Washington, D.C., don't chase the valley. Like, stop with the social media crap, because number one, we're not going to like build something that's authentic to us in Washington, D.C. by trying to out dating app, Silicon Valley. And more importantly, like, that's not playing to our strengths, right? That's not leveraging what we can do. And also, like, how many dating apps and photo sharing tools and subscription cat food services does the world really need? Whereas, walk into your doctor's office and you'll find like $6 billion opportunities within the first 15 minutes, right? But those opportunities are created by the fact that it's more about policy innovation, right? A lot of that stuff exists because ... the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services have this bill code thing in place, and you can't bill this other way, and so you have these monstrous economic inefficiencies that are horrible for patients and horrible for providers that persist. And so as an entrepreneur, you can't just look at it through the lens of how do I build great tech or how do I build a compelling UX. You have to look at it through the lens of how do I regulatory hack.
Interesting that you bring up the healthcare, because for those of you who were with us Wednesday with Jennifer Polka, she brought up like the crisis/disaster that happened with the healthcare.gov website with the ACA. And so I know, Evan, that you had a hand in not creating that, but prior to
thank
that,
you.
yeah,
No, I did not have any hand at all in creating that.
Tell us about your failure. No, you had
many failures. That was not what. That was not one of my failures.
We'll talk about your failures in a minute. But I know you had a hand in the creation of Recoveryorg, which was one of the government's websites. And so I'd like you, we talked about it earlier this morning, but I think the audience might be interested in hearing how you got involved in that.
Yeah, so by way of, I mean, it's funny you referenced Jen and Tim, but by way of sort of backstory on the whole thing, this would have been right after Obama was elected, so sort of early 2008. I had been living in Europe for 5 or 6 years. I'd just come home. I was born and raised in the DC region, came home to the DC region, and was really, really struck. I wanted to sort of take, when I was in Europe, I was studying kind of public policy. I had previously built startups, and I was fascinated by the sort of junction of the policy world and the startup world. And this was right when Tim had sort of pivoted from Web 2.0 is everything to Gov 2.0. And he was hosting these big conferences and bringing all this energy in the way that Tim really uniquely can to sort of creating a meme, creating an idea, putting it out there. And that was kind of the coolest thing around. And so I decided to launch a small startup by pulling together some of my old startup friends to say, hey, we're going to go do this Gov 2.0 stuff, and we're going to transform government. And that was right when Obama was elected, so it was a really heady time. Right? It was this sense that we actually could just come in a year or two and transform the federal government and be done with it. Many of us are still working on that problem. We were out doing. I think we were working on our first big project was something for the Army Corps of Engineers to help them collaborate better or something, and then this RFP dropped. And if you don't remember, it was one of the very first things that the Obama administration passed was the Recovery Act. Let's go spend $900 billion to stimulate the economy at a really bad time economically. And let's stave off the Great Depression essentially by just pumping fiscal stimulus in. And one of the big concerns was, well, if you pump that much money that quickly into the economy, you're just going to get massive amounts of fraud, waste, and abuse. So the response was no. It was written into the legislation. Literally the requirements for the website were written into law, and it said there is going to be a website called recovery.gov. Any citizen is going to be able to go and see where every dollar is getting spent in their local community. They're going to be able to see the jobs that were created. They're going to be able to see the status of the project, and they're going to be able to report fraud, waste, and abuse. So we're going to, in some way, crowdsource accountability around how this $900 billion gets spent. And the deadline for that website being up and running was 1 year after the act was passed. And in proper federal government fashion, nothing happened for the first however many months. And then an RFP drops that says, hey, we really, really have to get this website up in 12 weeks. We really have to get this thing up in 12 weeks. And so I looked at it and I'm like, that's cool. If you're going to go change government, let's change government. That was an amazing, incredibly interesting, heady experience because the whole project actually reported up to Biden. And it was my first experience with large-scale culture change, transformational change within the federal government. And it gave me a completely distorted and biased view of things because it was all of these obstacles that would present themselves, we would put a call in, and then the White House would put a call in, and the obstacle just magically disappears. It was have this sort of superpower of going, bureaucracy be gone, and then no other thing I ever did in trying to bring innovation to the federal government after that ever had that same superpower, and I'm like, wow, this actually is really tough and painful and sucks. But the project was really tough, right? Because actually one of the dirty truths at the time was that if you asked, federal government accounting systems weren't particularly accurate. Really, actually, no one really knew where the money was going. Not in a nefarious way necessarily, just in a way that actually in most big corporations, no one really knows where the money's going, but just blow that up on a huge scale. And so you couldn't just sort of go, hey, I'm going to tap into the APIs, tell me where all the money's going, and I'm just going to throw it up on a website. And so we actually took this totally different approach, which was we required every one of the recipients of the money, which was 100,000 recipients, 140,000 projects, $900 billion, to report each quarter on exactly how much money they had received, how much had been committed, what they were doing, et cetera. And then we had to make it hugely scalable. And so it was, the interesting part was it was one of the first big experiments in government transparency and open government and APIs and all that. The part that ended up being much more transformational was we didn't think we had a snowflake's chance in hell of winning this RFP because we had a week to turn it around, and it was the hottest thing out there. And so we were let's just throw every crazy cool idea we have in there because we're not going to win anyway, so we might as well just go for it. And one of the ideas was we were let's use this thing that startups in the Valley are using called Amazon Web Services. Because if you're going to build a badass website, you should just build it on Amazon Web Services anyway. We had no idea that literally at that point there had never been a government website that was run on Amazon because Amazon had decided for tax reasons they would not do websites on the federal government for any government without getting into all these totally weird issues of they couldn't do business at that point in certain jurisdictions because otherwise they would get charged sales taxes on selling you the subscription cat food and whatever else. So anyway, so we get this whole proposal, we win, and we're this is amazing. And then we go to swipe our credit card on Amazon Web Services, and it's can't do business with the federal government. So we reach out to Amazon, and they were like, huh. And they it literally in a week and a half goes all the way up the chain, and we get a call, and we're like, Jeff is exploring the issue. And we're like, and then we get a call back in another week, and they're like, we've decided we will sell cloud services to the federal government. In fact, do you know anybody who we could hire to go build this business for us? That's now a $7 or $8 billion a year business for Amazon. They literally run the entire infrastructure for the CIA. But nobody knew how to do it. No one had any idea how to do security certifications, do anything and so it was this, back to the superpower part, it was everybody on the fly in a couple of weeks figured out how the hell you do federal security requirements for cloud computing. And so things like that, where you're that totally wasn't supposed to be the long-term legacy and consequence, but it had this massive ripple effect of the biggest, most high-profile project was done on this, and pretty much every federal CIO was suddenly running around Googling what is Amazon Web Services and what is the cloud.
Wow. So my takeaway from that is Amazon truly does everything, and it's really helpful to have access to the top.
Yes.
Yes. So we, Evan and I had talked
Read
about
the
this
chapter
as
in the
well.
book on influencers.
Right. Influencers are important, and they get shit done. But you had, talking about that example about having access to the vice president. You're trying to do a project, you have obstacles, you call the vice president, obstacles are gone. This is a great segue into the conversation I wanted to have with you about Dubai.
Well, let me pause though,
Yes.
because I'm gonna. There's one great anecdote from this whole story that I did not tell,
Oh, do share.
which is the flip side of having access to power. So before the website launches, and this is timely, down the anecdote, before the website launches, we have to literally go present the website to the vice president, to Biden. He is literally going to give the final approval to say this website is ready to go. So we go to the White House, and it's I think at that point it was my first time in the White House, and it was a really, really intimidating thing to go present a website to the vice president. And I get up and I doing my presentation on all the amazingly innovative things and the use of geospatial and APIs and all of this, and finally Biden interrupts, and he goes, look, I don't know anything about APIs, I don't know anything about geospatial. He goes, but I know the American people, and the American people want jobs, and I don't see where on this website they're going to go find jobs. And I'm literally, what's running through my brain is Mr. Vice President, the requirements for the website are written into law, and nowhere in there is be able to find a job. And I'm like, okay. And he's like, so we need this website up, launched in 3 days, and it needs to be able to help American people find jobs. Get to it. And then leaves, drops the mic and walks out, and we're like, huh, okay. And so we get back and we're like, how do we build Monster.com on steroids spanning the entire US economy in 3 days? And we ended up, but again, in the presence of constraints, one innovates. And so we literally called up, I think it was Microsoft, we called up the Bing search team, and we were like, if we just feed you an API with the website addresses of every one of the 100,000 organizations that receive this money, and we send you words that sound like job postings, can you create a custom search scope for us in 6 hours that's just a search filter of 100,000 websites and things that look like job postings? And they're like, yeah, actually we can. And we got the next morning, we got it, we threw up a little website to it, we came back and we're like, you have a job search engine of the US economy. So that is one of my favorite Biden anecdotes. And if you've watched him, that is generally how he rolls on things. Yeah. All right, so anyway, Dubai.
That's such a great Biden story. Thank you for that, and very interesting. And I don't want to take a ton of time. I know we're short on time, and I do want to get into the book on regulatory hacking, but Evan and I had a really fascinating conversation earlier. So 1776, when it first expanded internationally, they went first to Dubai, which if any of you follow Dubai in the last 5 years or so, they have gone big with technology. I mean, they've just kind of bypassed self-driving cars. They have self-driving planes, and they've got robotic police force. It's just and it's a very different place than Maine, so probably kind of difficult to draw parallels between Dubai.
They're both on the water. What?
We have access to water. We have people. But that's kind of where the parallels might end. But I just thought it was fascinating. You went to Dubai and you shared some stories about your experience there. So I think maybe briefly, if you don't mind touching on that.
We didn't actually go to Dubai. I mean, like, again, part of the thesis of like what makes Washington D.C. unique was that almost as soon as we launched, we had like embassies coming through like crazy. And one of the strangest aspects for me, I think, I was sitting there the other day and someone was like looking at some profile picture on some random tool, and they were like, "Is that you and David Cameron talking?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they were like, "Huh?" And I was like, "Actually, once we launched 1776 and it's in DC, like every freaking world leader that came through DC would come by." And so I have this remarkable collection of pictures of like world leaders. And the weird thing was but a bunch of them would walk through for like 45 minutes and go, "This is incredible. I want this in my country, make it happen." And most of those you'd be like, "Okay, yeah, whatever," and you wouldn't follow up, or the economics didn't make sense. But the Emiratis came through, and they were like, "No, we really, really, really want this in Dubai," and we're like, "Okay, like Dubai, whatever." And at the time, it was like a tourist and in transportation place. You didn't think it of all at startups, and then they were like, "No, we really, really want you in Dubai, and we have a lot of money." Like.
And a king who can make stuff happen.
Yeah, well, I didn't even realize that at that point. So I think I had like a free week in August, not realizing that Dubai in August is the hottest. And not just, you think to yourself, but it's a dry heat. It's not a dry heat. It's on the Persian Gulf. It is both the most humid and the hottest place you can possibly imagine. So yeah, poor form there. But rocked up in Dubai and was fascinated by the environment. Yeah, like could not be further from Washington, D.C., right? You have an absolute monarch who controls most of the capital, runs the government, and owns most of the major businesses. And, like, good to be king. Yeah, and so, like, I spent a bunch of time. And literally over the course of a week, as I was meeting everybody, I started developing a deck, which was kind of like with the Recovery.gov project. It was like we're not going to do this, and they're not going to do this, but, like, if you really want to build a startup ecosystem in Dubai, these are all the things you would do, right? You would redirect all your public sector agencies, which you have the most direct control over, and require that they start putting out startup challenges. You would, Emirates Towers is the like giant twin towers in the middle of Dubai. It's the equivalent of the Dubai White House. So like all of the major government offices, all the big corporations are housed there. And in the ground floor was at the time, was a mall, like a really high-end shopping mall. And I was like, you'd get rid of this mall and you would like make it like a giant startup incubator, right? So everybody who has to come and interact with the ruler of Dubai would get the immediate signal that this is what route we're going. You'd bring in freaking WeLive, and because it's an expensive place to live, I'm like, you'd figure out co-living. This is all the stuff you would do. And they were like, okay. And I was like, and you'd probably like need to change your laws and redirect your policy environment. And they were like, okay, which laws? I'm like, I probably need a bankruptcy law. I'm thinking, I don't know, like, just throwing off the top of my head. And so it really was like that. And so then, in probably like a couple 6-8 weeks, we sort of got everything pulled together. And they took one of the stores that was in like one of the shops that was in this mall, and they chucked him out, and like literally, like they were like, it'll take us. We gave them 30 days notice, and I'm like, that's harsh. And then like 2 months later, they own the construction company, so like we had 1776 in Dubai, and that was in the really early days. And in parallel, they took the idea of like public sector challenges. They created the Dubai Future Accelerators. We ended up getting involved in a lot of programs around actually driving regulatory change and innovation regulatory change. And it just blew up. And we were saying, like, the Dubai case study is both incredibly interesting and totally irrelevant. And it's interesting because, like, it's irrelevant because it's Disney World, right? It's like, great, it's awesome if you happen to have an absolute monarch who decides that the next big thing for their country is to become a startup mecca. Like, that's great. And bears zero resemblance to what you guys are dealing with in Maine or what I deal with in Washington, D.C., or what New York City deals with or anything else. But it is interesting because it is the sort of edge case that says, if you were king and you could do anything, how would you go from 0 to 60 in building a globally recognized startup ecosystem? What would you do? And it worked.
Right.
And so, you know, I would always say, like, if you really want to understand startup ecosystem building, if you really want to understand regulatory hacking, like, go to Dubai. There's some really fun case studies about Dubai in the book, some really fun stories. But like, go to Dubai and study it, and like, think about it as an edge case. Come back and then go. Now, it's going to take me 30 years to do what they did in 3 years, and it's going to be a lot more messy and all that stuff. But it may well be more sustainable in the long run because, you know, democracy is messy. ... But it probably is a better model in the long run.
No, that's fascinating, and I could talk about that for the rest of the morning. So check out the book for the interesting.
I mean, just check out the book in general. I think that's the theme of the whole talk. Is check out the book.
But I know we have a limited time, so I do want to spend some of the rest of the time before we open it to Q&A on the book, which is titled Regulatory Hacking, a Playbook for Startups. And this book has gotten some fantastic praise from some of the biggest names in Silicon Valley and in the startup world. So I'm just curious if you could tell us all, just maybe baseline, like, what is regulatory hacking?
So the regulatory hacking is how to get shit done if you are a startup that's trying to operate in a heavily regulated industry, right? But the thesis of the book is that, and again, it was interesting because like when we started out at 1776, everybody looked at us like we were completely insane when we were like, honestly, we're just going to focus on the really nasty regulated markets. And that was back when you still had lots of VCs that were like, we don't focus on, we won't invest in any startup that has regulatory risk. And I always look at them, I'm like, do you know that's like functionally impossible? Like, there is no company that has no regulatory risk. That's not. And they were like, no, we invest in like Facebook. And I'm like, whoa, boy, that one's gonna bite you in the ass at some point. But like, I mean, after you've made billions and billions of dollars, but still, and the book is kind of, in a certain sense, having like spent years investing in and advising and supporting like thousands of startups in these industries. It was sort of the whole, you know what, the playbook that you get from Silicon Valley was awesome when the height of innovation was building a dating app, right? But if you really want to go off and launch self-driving cars, if you want to go build human brain to computer interfaces, if you want to go transform the way the energy sector works and not waste catastrophic amounts of capital a la the clean tech boom of 15 years ago, like, you have to develop a different playbook. And you need to take the best elements of the Silicon Valley model, but you have to apply it through a very different lens of how do you actually accumulate and wisely apply power to get things done. And I think the argument, right, is that, and I think now it is a much less controversial thesis. Even when I wrote the book 2 years ago now, or started writing the book 3 years ago now, like, it was still viewed as a niche area. I think now it is fully blown up to say almost all of the really interesting startup ideas and almost all of the big venture capital is now flowing, in fact, in a way that a lot of people have not recognized, squarely into unbelievably regulated sectors in which regulatory challenges, regulatory arbitrage are in fact the central crux of the innovation chain. It's not, sometimes it's hard tech, sometimes it's design, but a lot of it is like, how do we navigate this stuff, right? Uber being a canonical example, right? Like, the Uber app is not really all that complex technology. Overturning the existing regulatory and legal regimes in every city in the country, that was hard, right? And so, but again, like, Uber, relatively speaking, is on the low end of the regulatory risk consequences, right? You know, putting robotic drones flying through all the skies of the city, not hard to imagine some bad shit that can go down, right? With the first time a burrito freaking dropping thing accidentally beheads someone, you're like, oh gosh, who could have imagined that putting little tiny self-driving flying things through the sky was a potentially risky idea. So, and I think there's a lot of stuff that's driving that, right? One is, one of the theses I talk about a lot in the book that I think is really important, or a trend, is like, we're here in Portland, Maine, and we're having this conversation. We're talking about startups, and we're talking about innovation and investment, and we wouldn't have been doing that 10 years ago. We might not have been doing that 5 years ago. And you can go to every freaking city in the world. And I think the moment at which I decided you could truly say every city was when I was invited by the State Department to go speak in Harare, Zimbabwe, right? Which is in our minds is failed state central. Rocked up in Harare, Zimbabwe, and I don't know what I was expecting, but it was cool, let's take you to the incubators. You should meet some of our angel investors. These are our top 2 accelerators. Here's our entrepreneurs. And I'm like, wow, they're building some really badass fintech stuff because they have a completely failed banking sector, so they really need to figure out cryptocurrencies and fintech. And I was like, wow, really, if you have internet access and you have educated young people, you have a startup ecosystem. As we have massively diversified where you can build startups, we are also diversifying who can build startups and implicitly what problems matter. And that's a good thing, and that's an incredibly healthy thing, because even today it can still feel like Silicon Valley is being driven by the problems that a 26-year-old who has recently graduated from Stanford perceives to be important. So when we had that giant rush of laundry delivery startups, you're like, wow, your mom didn't teach you how to do your own laundry, did she? But we've now invested hundreds of millions of dollars in capital into getting our laundry done for us, right? Is this really the highest and best use of capital and talent? Such a big trend. I think another big trend is just, again, the low-hanging fruit has sort of been plucked. So if you're going to go off and say, hey, I have this great idea for music sharing, that's awesome. And have fun going through the incredible amounts of capital and talent that's gone behind Spotify and Amazon Music and whatever Apple's doing now and all this other stuff, right? Whereas, as I've said before, just go to your doctor's office and you'll find numerous billion-dollar problems that have totally been untouched. And then I think the other part is just I grew up as a science fiction geek, and then I married a woman who remains a science fiction geek. She named our son after the android that saves the world in the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. She's really into science fiction. And it truly, she made me go back and reread the Foundation series, because she was if you really want to understand how to start thinking about AI, regulation, and robots, go read Foundation again. And it's happening all around us, and all these ideas that I grew up reading in science fiction are becoming real every day. And the kinds of technology that are coming to bear right now, the risks that they present, and the opportunity for impact that they can have absolutely dwarf Facebook, right? Sure, Facebook can make us all deeply psychologically unhealthy and potentially take down democracy, but wait until we build the robot army that thinks for itself, right? That's a whole other level. So so you bring all this together, and I think there's a key reason. But again, you have to understand power, how you accumulate power, how you use power wisely through the lens of building a lean startup in a totally different way. And that's what the sort of book is designed to do, and do it largely through telling stories and case studies and examples of startups who have done this well.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it to Q&A. And just to note, I have 3 pages of questions in front of me, and I haven't even gotten through the first one. So it's just a sign of a great conversation and just kind of taking it where it goes. But when we talk about regulatory hacking and we talk about regulation, if we talk about regulation or talk about changing it or enacting it, that gets extremely political and partisan. But I know you don't view it that way. So how do we deal with the politics and the partisanship when we talk about regulation?
Wow.
There you go. That's our last question
Yeah, I
of
was
the
about to
day.
say,
So solve that, and we can all go.
So I don't view it that way for most of this stuff. I mean, the vast, vast majority of the issues that startups deal with are not ones that get caught up in the sort of particular hyper-partisan moment we're having. And the vast, vast majority of them really don't deal with the federal government, actually. They deal with state, and frequently most of it is local. If you're figuring out, do we have is the sort of army of scooters descended upon Portland, Maine yet? Okay, just wait.
It's coming.
Those are local issues. Like, gosh, we have people flying along on little tiny scooters on the sidewalks. Like, that's an argument that communities have been having for time immemorial, is who can do what on the sidewalks in public spaces. And so, again, by and large, most local issues aren't really actually that hyperpartisan, even if people sort of want to make them. And even the stuff at the federal government level just doesn't tend to rise to that level. Now, yes, there are exceptions to that, but like, actually, how are we going to regulate drones? Like, I was about to say you don't hear Donald Trump tweeting about drone regulation, but you really never know what Donald Trump is going to tweet about. But like, it's just not an issue that's a Democrat, Republican, philosophy of government. And at this point, I can't actually figure out what either party's philosophy of government is anymore anyway. So I don't tend to view it through that lens. Like, one of the stories I tell in the book is just sort of an aside, was like, in general, if you're a startup and you're trying to regulatory hack, or you're an investor and you're trying to advise them, like, a good rule of thumb is the more local the issue is and the more weird and obtuse the issue is, the easier it is to get something done. So probably don't go out and say we want to change across the entire country the nature of insurance regulation for healthcare for my startup to work. Probably going to be one that's going to take a lot of time. But when we launched the 1776 seed fund in DC, we were like going through the whole legal process, and our lawyers said, well, you really are going to have to be in Virginia or Maryland, which are the states on either side of DC. And we were like, why? And they were like, oh, well, DC has this weird thing where they regulate a little tiny venture fund exactly the same that would a billion-dollar hedge fund. So everyone that's involved in the seed fund is going to have to go off and go through this like 18 months of training to become registered investment advisors and get a Series 7 and do all this stuff. And we were like, that's just dumb. And they were like, oh, no, that's why all the VCs are either just across the line in Virginia or just across the line in Maryland. And I was like, huh, they are. Like, NEA, one of the biggest and most successful venture funds in the world, is based in the DC region, and it's literally like 50 feet from the DC line in Maryland. And I was like, that's odd. And so I called up the deputy mayor, and I'm like, did you know this is a thing? Like, did you know that there's no venture funds actually in the city because of this? And he was like, I had no idea. And I was like, how do we fix this? And he was like, I don't know. And he called up the head of the security industry regulator in DC, and he was like, did you know this was a thing? And the guy was like, absolutely no idea. What is a venture fund? And like, we explained it to him, and he's like, yeah, I can't imagine that we care at all about $10 million seed funds. And he was like, well, what language do you need to get changed? And so we called up our attorneys, and they were like, well, this is actually specifically the guiding stuff. We sent it over, and they were like, all right, it's probably going to take us a month or two, but let's see what we can do. And then they just changed the regulation. And like, we set up our venture fund in DC. And the point there is, like, it's a totally esoteric issue nobody actually gives a shit about, and everyone had just assumed it was this immutable thing that shall never be changed, that DC had decided they didn't want venture funds. And like, it wasn't. It was just a thing, and it just had to get fixed, and it wasn't actually that hard. But back to influence, it's really helpful when you can pick up the phone to the deputy mayor, right? Like, that makes things move faster. And that's one of the, like, I think culturally, like, one of the elements that it's fascinating to me, because if you spend time with a lot of, particularly that slice of people in the Valley who make you want to just sort of roll your eyes and smack your head on Twitter, there's sort of that particular Valley ethos where you want to be like, you're pretty disconnected from real life, aren't you? And they'll tell you with absolute certainty that the Silicon Valley is the last pure meritocracy left on the planet. But don't pitch any venture fund without a warm introduction, because they need gatekeepers. And I'm like, never mind. And the reality is that, there is this sort of ethos that your product, your idea, your app is somehow supposed to win. And that, like, knowing people and knowing the right people and knowing people who can get you to even more powerful people and to get things done, like, that is actually how the Valley works. If any of you have ever tried to raise capital in the Valley, that is 100% how Silicon Valley works. It's just not how Silicon Valley wants to perceive itself. But when you tell people, if you want to get things done in regulated industries, you are one way or another going to have to figure out how to build a network that gets you access to powerful people, there's sort of this hue and cry of, oh, well, this is somehow unfair and distorted. And I'm like, guys, it's the way the world works. But influence is important.
And I think we're out of time. So with that, I want to thank Evan so much for joining us this morning. It was a pleasure to have you
Thank
here.
you, guys.